My name is Evelyn Moore. I'm 61 years old. And the night my own son asked me to leave his wedding, I understood that love, no matter how deep, can sometimes turn against you. I remember standing there under the glow of 1,000 tiny lights. Every guest frozen. Every whisper slicing through the air. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't have to. His silence was enough to break something inside me that I thought could never be broken. I've spent most of my life surrounded by beauty textures, fabric, and light. I used to design dresses for women who wanted to feel seen, even if just for a single night. When I retired, I traded sequins for stillness. My days became quiet, filled with coffee at 7:15 in the morning, soft music, and long walks by the river near Charleston. After losing my husband, I promised myself peace. And for a while, I had it. But peace can be fragile. Sometimes it shatters not with thunder but with a single N-A-A whispered word. That evening at the wedding, when my son's eyes met mine, I knew something had shifted long before anyone spoke. It wasn't just humiliation, I felt it was recognition. The kind that tells you the story you thought you were living has changed its course completely. If you have a moment, I'll tell you how it all began before the betrayal. Before the silence. Back when everything still felt safe. Most mornings began the same way. At 7:15 in the morning, sunlight slipped through the curtains in my Charleston home, painting thin gold lines across the kitchen table. I would pour a cup of coffee strong, dark, and a little bitter, the way I liked it, and step out to the porch to listen to the river. The air smelled faintly of salt and jasmine, a scent that had become the rhythm of my days. After 40 years in the fashion world, I had finally learned to live without deadlines. Retirement didn't feel like an ending to me, it felt like exhaling after a lifetime of holding my breath. The house was quiet now. My husband's tools still hung in the garage. And I kept his old chair by the window, even though I never sat in it. Loss, I learned, doesn't always demand sadness, sometimes it asks for gentleness instead. I found comfort in small things, fresh linens, the hum of the sewing machine, the soft scratch of pencil on sketch paper. Every stitch I made was just for me now. Not for clients or runways. It was a way of staying connected to something I loved, without the noise that used to come with it. My son Daniel was the bright thread that tied everything together. He was 35, driven, kind, and so full of hope that sometimes I thought he was sunlight in human form. I had raised him alone after my husband passed, and seeing the man he'd become made every lonely night worth it. He called often, always asking if I was eating well, if I was resting enough. I would smile and say yes, though sometimes the quiet stretched a little too long after the call ended. I didn't know it then, but the quiet I'd grown to love was about to be disturbed by a voice, a smile, and a presence that would change everything. It started with a phone call one Thursday afternoon, around 4:45. Daniel's name flashed on my screen, and I smiled before answering. His voice carried that careful kind of warmth, the one he used when he was trying to prepare me for something. He said he wanted to bring someone over for dinner that weekend, a woman he'd been seeing. His words were gentle, measured, too thoughtful. I remember thinking it wasn't what he said that unsettled me, it was what he didn't. By 6:30 in the evening on Saturday, I had the table set. The house smelled of roasted chicken and rosemary. I wore a soft gray dress and my favorite silver pendant, simple, familiar, grounding. When the doorbell rang, Daniel's smile filled the doorway first, bright and nervous. Behind him stood Alyssa. She was radiant in the kind of way that felt rehearsed. Her beauty so precise, it left no room for warmth. Her perfume arrived before she did floral. Expensive, almost overwhelming. She offered her hand with a smile that never touched her eyes. Her nails gleamed like glass, and her voice was sugar over steel. During dinner, she laughed at everything Daniel said, quick and bright, like someone performing happiness. I listened, watching her every small gesture, the way her gaze drifted to the silverware, the chandelier, the china cabinet. Her compliments were laced with questions: how large the house was, whether I'd kept my shares in my old design firm, what kind of fabric the curtains were made from. Each question felt like a thread pulling at something beneath the surface. Daniel, sweet and oblivious, looked enchanted. He poured her more wine, brushed a crumb from her sleeve. I wanted to be happy for him. I truly did. But as the evening stretched on, the room began to feel smaller, the air denser. Alyssa's laughter echoed too long, her eyes studying me between smiles. There was a rhythm to her charm, predictable, practiced, perfect. When they left, I stood alone in the quiet house, clearing the dishes one by one. The candlelight flickered across the table like a warning. I've spent a lifetime reading fabrics, learning how to tell silk from imitation. That night, I felt it again, that subtle difference between real and almost real. Something told me this woman wasn't what she seemed. And deep down, I knew peace never leaves quietly. The weeks that followed blurred together in a strange mixture of joy and unease. Daniel visited often at first, always with Alyssa beside him. They would bring takeout, talk about their new projects, and laugh in ways that made the house feel alive again. For a while, I tried to believe her presence was a blessing, that maybe this was the peace Daniel's life had been missing. But as time passed, I began to notice the subtle shift in tone, the new distance hidden beneath their smiles. Alyssa had a way of turning warmth into performance. She spoke softly, yet every word seemed placed with purpose. When she complimented me, it was always followed by a faint correction, a gentle suggestion about how things could be updated. I found myself second-guessing the smallest things: how I arranged the flowers, how I seasoned the roast. Daniel began to echo her opinions, not out of malice, but out of admiration. He looked at her the way he once looked at me when he was a boy, trusting, open, ready to please. And for the first time, that look wasn't mine to receive. By late October, I noticed their visits grew shorter. Calls that used to last an hour now ended after 10 minutes. I'd hear Alyssa in the background, laughing softly, and Daniel's voice lowering, as if our conversations were something private she didn't need to hear. At dinner one evening, she placed her hand over his and told me with that same bright smile that Daniel was teaching her how to handle complicated family dynamics. The words were gentle, but the meaning stung like a hidden needle. Then came the smallest, cruelest shift. Daniel called one night around 8:15 to ask if I had forgotten about a meeting he'd told me about, something I was sure had never been mentioned. I remember the pause before he spoke again, a hesitation that chilled me. Alyssa thought I seemed forgetful lately, tired, maybe even confused. I laughed it off. But after hanging up, I sat in the quiet kitchen and felt something heavy settle inside me. It wasn't anger, it was realization. The danger I sensed wasn't loud or dramatic. It wore perfume and smiled sweetly. It hid behind affection, behind concern. And for the first time, I felt afraid not of losing Daniel's love, but of what might happen if I stayed silent. That night, I understood some storms arrive wearing silk gloves. It began with the smallest things, details so ordinary that, at first, I brushed them aside. A bank statement left open on the kitchen counter one morning at 8:45. A line of transfers I didn't recognize, with Daniel's name listed under a shared account I had never agreed to. When I asked about it later, he smiled too easily. saying something about simplifying finances. His tone was calm, but his eyes avoided mine. I wanted to believe it was nothing. But deep down, a quiet voice reminded me that lies often wear the mask of kindness. Alyssa had started visiting, even when Daniel wasn't around. She would sit with a glass of wine, asking questions wrapped in concern about my will, my old clients, even the property's insurance. I told myself she was just curious, but each visit left me feeling smaller in my own home. One afternoon, she glanced at my sketchbook and mentioned how cluttered things must be at my age. The words lingered like smoke. Then came the misplaced mail, the rearranged drawers, the forgotten passwords I never changed. When I mentioned it to Daniel, he gently reminded me that memory slips were normal. He sounded almost rehearsed, like someone had told him exactly what to say. It wasn't the words that broke me, it was the pity in his voice. The son I raised to trust his instincts was now questioning mine. One night, I couldn't sleep. Around 3:15 in the morning, I went through my old files, design contracts, investments, things that had defined my life's work. A document caught my eye. The ownership details of my late husband's property had been updated. My signature looked perfect, too perfect. The lines were steady, precise, and I knew I hadn't touched that paper in years. For a long moment, I sat in silence, listening to the soft hum of the refrigerator and my own heartbeat in the dark. Anger would have been easy. Panic, even easier. But neither would help me now. I'd spent decades mastering patience, stitching order into chaos one thread at a time. This would be no different. I closed the file carefully, smoothed the edges, and turned off the light. Truth, I told myself, reveals itself slowly. And sometimes, silence is the sharpest tool of all. That was the night I decided to stop doubting my instincts and start preparing for the truth. The truth came to me on a quiet Saturday morning around 10:20. Wrapped in the kind of coincidence that never feels accidental. I was at a vintage jewelry exhibition in Savannah, wandering through displays of gold and glass. When I heard my name called, it was an old colleague from my design days. A woman whose eye for detail had once saved me from a disastrous show. She hugged me, chatted about old times, then mentioned she'd just sold a collection once owned by a woman named Alyssa Whitmore. The name struck like static, too familiar, too close. Her tone shifted when she described the sale. The jewelry had come from a man in Denver, part of a scandal involving a marriage, a vanishing act, and a large sum of money. My pulse didn't race, it slowed, steady and cold. That night, I couldn't sleep. Around 11:30, I searched through public records, names, and old photos. It didn't take long to find what I feared: Alyssa's face, repeated across different lives. 2 previous marriages, both ending quietly. Both men left with empty accounts and broken reputations. The pattern was perfect. Too perfect. Every husband had something she could gain, and every story ended with her disappearing just before exposure. I closed the laptop gently, staring at my reflection in the darkened screen. I wasn't imagining it. I had been right all along. Still, proof demanded precision. I reached out to an old contact, someone who once tracked counterfeit designs for luxury brands. By Tuesday evening, he'd sent me a discreet file. It contained photos, bank records, testimonies, and at the center of it all was Alyssa, her charm immortalized in each captured smile. The truth was sharp enough to cut through denial. Yet I felt no triumph, just an ache that reached deep into my bones. When Daniel came by that weekend, I thought of telling him, but before I could, he told me Alyssa was worried about me. He said I seemed distracted, Forgetful words that were not his. Not truly. They were hers. Stitched carefully into his voice. He smiled with pity. And I realized that the boy I raised was no longer standing in front of me. The son I knew would have seen the truth in my eyes. That night, I sat in my studio, surrounded by old sketches and the scent of jasmine soap. I threaded a needle through silk. My hand steady. My breath even. I wasn't powerless. I had lived through storms before. This one would be no different. Pain could wait, precision could not. From that moment on, I stopped reacting. I started preparing. The next chapter wouldn't be about heartbreak, it would be about design. And this time, the pattern would expose her. When pain becomes too heavy to carry, it hardens into focus. That was the shift I felt one morning around 8:26, sitting by the window with untouched coffee growing cold in my hands. I had cried enough. The time for emotion had ended, now came the time for truth. Anga. I realized. Burns too fast. But patience, patience endure. I began small. Quietly. I went through my records with the same care I once reserved for sewing silk gowns, steady hands. No wasted motion. I photographed documents. Recorded phone calls. When Alyssa's voice grew too sweet, too careful, I learned to keep my face composed. My tone pleasant. My curiosity invisible. When she spoke of the future, I listened. When Daniel mentioned changes to streamline finances, I nodded. My silence became my shield. At 10:31 night, I called Marion, the same colleague who'd once unknowingly handed me the first clue. I told her enough to gain her trust, not enough to risk the plan. She connected me with a private investigator named Grant, a man who specialized in corporate fraud. He worked swiftly, discreetly, and without judgment. Within a week, I had files, scanned images, bank statements, marriage certificates. Every piece of evidence was labeled, organized, and undeniable. I met with my attorney, reviewed my own estate, and prepared contingencies. I knew that when this ended, there would be no shouting, no vengeance, only light and proof. The house was still at night, filled with the hum of old clocks and the faint smell of lavender soap. Each sound reminded me of what I stood to lose and what I refused to surrender. By the time Daniel announced the wedding date, I already knew. That day would not just mark a union, it would be a reckoning. I would not interrupt or plead. I would simply let the truth speak in my place. And when it did, it would shine too brightly for anyone to ignore. The wedding took place at 5:30 in the evening. In a glass ballroom overlooking the river, everything shimmered: the chandeliers, the marble floors. Even the air seemed to glitter with the illusion of perfection. I wore a soft silver gown I'd designed years ago. Simple and elegant. Nothing that begged for attention. I sat near the back, watching Daniel greet guests. His smile, warm but fragile. I wondered if he sensed the storm waiting beneath the lace and laughter. Alyssa was breathtaking that night, radiant in a way that demanded every eye. She floated through the crowd with the poise of a woman who believed she had already won. When her gaze met mine across the room, it lingered just long enough to remind me that she knew I didn't belong in her story anymore. But I wasn't there to belong. I was there to end the illusion. When the speeches began, her tone shifted: sweetness, sharpened into control. She thanked everyone, then spoke of letting go of the past, of respecting boundaries. Her words dressed cruelty in politeness. And then, with that perfect smile, she turned to me in front of the entire room and suggested that perhaps I was tired. Perhaps it was time for me to leave and rest. The silence that followed was heavy enough to bend the chandeliers. I could feel every eye waiting for me to break. But I didn't. I stood, smoothed my dress, and walked toward the exit with calm steps. My heels echoed against the marble, each sound deliberate. As I reached the door, two familiar figures entered: Marion and Grant. They didn't need my words, the truth spoke for itself. Grant connected a small speaker to his phone, and within seconds, Alyssa's own voice filled the room. Smooth, calculated, talking about how, in a year, she'd own half of Daniel's company, and how convincing everyone I was, losing my mind had been easier than expected. The laughter stopped. The music fell away. I turned back only once, just long enough to see Daniel's face pale, the world around him collapsing into silence. Alyssa tried to speak, but the sound caught in her throat. Her mask had torn. I didn't stay to watch the rest. Some truths don't need an audience. I stepped outside into the cool night air, the river catching the last of the light. For the first time in months, I could finally breathe. And as the doors closed behind me, I knew that what came next would not be about revenge, but about healing. The morning after the wedding was quiet in a way I'll never forget. The phone didn't ring. No messages came. And for the first time in months, the silence didn't hurt, it felt like release. By 8:15 that morning, I sat by the same window where so much of this had begun, watching the sunlight trace soft lines across the floor. I thought about how endings never arrive with fireworks. They come gently, like a seam closing on its own. Daniel came to see me a few days later. His eyes looked older, his voice smaller. There were no explanations. No apologies, only the quiet understanding between a mother and a son who had both learned something the hard way. Alyssa had disappeared, leaving nothing but the faint scent of expensive perfume and a trail of unanswered questions. I didn't hate her. Pity, perhaps, but not hate. Pain that deep loses its sharpness when you let go of revenge. In the weeks that followed, I poured my energy into rebuilding not my reputation, but my purpose. I rented a small white studio near the river and named it Threads of Grace. Women came, some broken, some simply lost, and we sewed together. Not just fabric, but fragments of ourselves. The hum of the sewing machines became the rhythm of healing. I taught them that every tear can be mended, that even imperfect stitches can hold beautifully. Daniel visits sometimes, bringing coffee and small smiles. We talk less about the past now, and more about beginnings. At 7:45 one evening, I locked the workshop and stood outside, watching the sky turn gold over the river. The world felt balanced again. Not perfect, but honest. I realized then that peace isn't what you find after the storm, it's what you choose to create from the wreckage. And that choice would lead me to the final truth I wanted to share. Looking back now, I understand that truth doesn't always roar, it often whispers, waiting for the moment we're strong enough to listen. What happened to me wasn't just about betrayal, it was about learning the quiet power of grace. When you stop fighting to prove your worth and start standing in it, everything changes. I learned that dignity is louder than revenge. And forgiveness isn't weakness, it's choosing peace over poison. Life has a way of revealing what's real when the noise fades. And though it hurt to lose what I thought was love, I gained something far greater: clarity, calm, and the freedom to be whole again. So if you've ever been silenced, doubted, or betrayed, remember, this truth has its own timing, and it never misses its mark. Hold your head high, trust your light, and if my story touched you, share yours too, because honesty, like thread, binds us all together.